Creating the perfect vocal reverb can be tricky. Add too much and your vocals are washed out into the background and hard to hear clearly. Add too little on the other hand and your track may feel too intimate, stiff, and awkward. And to find a middle ground between the two requires some finesse. After years of producing and mixing music for artists that's ended up on TV, radio, and performed at major festivals, I've developed a simple 5-step process that helps me achieve a perfect vocal reverb sound every single time. And my goal is to share that with you in this video. So if you've been struggling with reverb and finding the right balance for it in your mixes, then this is going to be the perfect video for you. For this demonstration, I'll be using Perfect Room 2 from Denise Audio. You can certainly use any reverb that you prefer, but you'll understand why I specifically prefer this one as we work through each of the 5 steps I'm about to show you. Perfect Room 2 is just launched at a sale price of $39, marked down from the regular $79 price. And as a special bonus to you for watching this video, you can score an extra 10% off of Perfect Room 2 and any other Denise Audio plugins you like by simply using the discount code 5piece when checking out. But now let's talk about how to achieve the perfect vocal sound using my 5-step process. To begin, we first need to decide how we're going to apply the reverb. This is really step 0 before we even get into it. We can either A, apply it directly to our vocal track, which gives us the most control over the reverb's effect on the specific performance, or B, route our vocal track to a dedicated reverb bus, which allows us to easily apply the same reverb settings across multiple tracks, like backing vocals, creating a cohesive sonic space. Now for this demonstration, I'm actually going to apply it directly to my vocal track here, and I'm specifically going to put it into the last insert slot on our chain to make sure that it doesn't affect the processing that I applied before, like de-essing, EQ, compression, and more. However, if you're dealing with multiple vocals and ultimately want to affect them the same way, then it'll probably make more sense to apply this to a bus instead. Now with the reverb directly on our vocal, if I leave the mix at 100%, which is the default setting, it's ultimately going to be really drowned out by the reverb. So before we start, I'm going to play the track, reduce this mix knob down to a more tolerable level where I get a balance of my dry vocal and a little bit of that reverb effect, and then we can start dialing in our settings and working with the actual steps I'm about to show you.
If there's some highs, some lows around, we don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go?
So right here at 15% seems to be a good starting point. I'm able to hear the reverb texture in a more complementary way, while still being able to hear our actual vocal very clearly. We're now in a position to start this 5-step process. And that leads us to the first step we're going to explore, which is setting the length, otherwise known as the decay. The decay time is a fundamental aspect of our reverb sound. It ultimately determines how long the reverb tail lingers after the original sound source, or the vocal in this case, has stopped. Ideally, we want to set the decay time in reference to the actual tempo, and that'll help create a more musical and natural sounding reverb. To find the most appropriate decay time, in the past I would typically have to go online, search up a reverb time calculator, plug in my tempo and maybe some other numbers, and then get a calculation back that I would then input into my reverb plugin. And that's actually something you're probably going to have to do if you're not using PR2 like I am here. But Perfect Room 2 makes this really easy by simply turning on the length sync, which looks like a metronome here. It'll switch from being time-based to tempo-based. As you can see, I'm on a quarter note setting now, but I can go anywhere from a 16th triplet note all the way up to 4 bars. Now, because of how this track is, I'm specifically looking to have a more elongated, spacious type of reverb, so I'm probably going to lean more towards the longer setting. But let me just reset this, we'll play it, and dial in a length setting that's appropriate for this track.
If there's some high, there's some lows around, we don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some lows around, we don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some lows around, we don't know.
So right here with a 2-bar setting seems to be most appropriate to me. You can tell how it sounds a lot tighter when I go to the 1 bar or lower. In fact, as I get to these lower settings, I'm probably going to need to increase the mix, but the 2-bar setting felt really good to me. 4 was also not bad, but just a little bit too elongated. So I'm going to be shooting for a 2-bar setting in this particular instance. And just to show you something really cool as a side note, I can actually press this reverse button here, and now it's going to actually reverse the reverb.
If there's some high, there's some lows around, we don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go?
I'm not going to use it in this case, but this is a very interesting feature that can lead to some unique creative possibilities, especially with production more so than vocal reverb. That being said, we can further adjust the length and decay by specifically using the decay profile built into Perfect Room 2. This basically gives us more control over the shape of the decay. Moving it to the right with a positive value creates a slower decay with a more gradual drop off, whereas moving it to the left and producing a negative value creates a faster decay with an earlier drop off. We're still preserving the decay, of course, but ultimately fine-tuning it in a specific way. So let's play around with this and see where we end up.
If there's some high, there's some low, who's around, we don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some low, who's around, we don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go?
So it's interesting, you can hear how when I reduce the decay profile to a negative value that it almost basically eliminated the reverb altogether. So you can see how you can really tighten it up in a way if you have a very sloppy sounding reverb. However, you can also extend it into a positive value just like I did to add just a little bit more to it, a little bit more of that elongation, but obviously less so than pushing this to the 4-bar setting, for example, with the length. Now, with most plugins, you're simply going to set the decay, and that's it. We've already seen that I've adjusted 2 settings to really fine-tune that decay setting. However, PR2 also introduces one additional feature that allows me to further sculpt the decay specifically, and that is the halo setting here. This basically isolates the highs or low frequency depending on which way I decide to take it, and extends the decay for those frequencies specifically, offering a lingering spectral effect. So for example, when I play this and move to the right, you're going to hear that there's going to be a lot more decay being applied to the higher end frequencies, whereas when I move to the left, it does the opposite. It applies it more to the low end. Now me, I do like my darker type of reverbs a bit more, so I'll probably end up leaning towards the left, but let's reset this and see what we can do.
If there's some high, there's some low, who's around, we don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some low, who's around, we don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go?
So right there around minus 17% seems to be the trick for me. You can tell that when I pushed it high, basically the decay is almost focused onto the high end. You're really just hearing the high frequencies associated with the decay. Whereas when I push it towards the left, towards the low end, it's emphasizing the low end more and essentially concentrating the decay there. It's ultimately just giving you a couple of different textural options and ways to focus it without necessarily using an EQ. Now moving on to step 2, we want to set the pre-delay. Pre-delay is a setting that introduces a slight delay between the dry signal and the onset of the reverb. This allows the initial attack of the vocal to remain clear and upfront by preventing the reverb from masking it. Ultimately, our goal is to create a more clear and defined vocal by preventing the reverb from masking the initial attack of the dry vocal specifically. This helps ensure the dry vocal remains upfront and clear. And what do you know, just like with the length, the Perfect Room 2 plugin has a built-in tempo sync for pre-delay, which is really a key reason why I love this plugin. It makes things really easy to dial in exactly where you want them tempo-wise, and helps get around the need to use a reverb time calculator. Now for me, I typically want to introduce just a small amount of pre-delay, and you'll see because I'll push this and you're going to understand what I'm talking about in a moment, but I want to just introduce a small amount of pre-delay to essentially get the reverb out of the way of the initial attack of the vocal. That means I'm going to usually rely on a quicker setting, so let's play this and find it.
If there's some high, there's some low, who's around, we don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some low, who's around, we don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go?
So right here at 1/16 seems to be perfect for me. We're able to hear that intelligibility and forwardness from the dry vocal, but we're still able to hear the reverb at the same time. And you can tell that when I push this to a more extreme setting, the delay was just really noticeable and throwing things off. Could be great for a specific stylistic purpose, but for me, I'm using this just to clear things up and reduce interference. And if you're using another reverb plugin, this is as far as it's going to go, but with Perfect Room 2, I also have access to an attack setting which could further help reduce this interference. While pre-delay delays the signal, the attack actually softens the initial impact of it, almost like a fade-in, making its entrance and effect sound a bit smoother. And just like pre-delay and some of the other settings here, this does have a tempo sync feature, which I'm going to utilize. And even though this is unique to PR2, let's manipulate it to see if it actually better complements our sound.
If there's some high, there's some low, who's around. If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go?
So hopefully you could hear that as I increased it, particularly once I hit that 1/16, 1/8 setting and above, now we're starting to hear that delay of the attack a little bit more clearly and noticeably, and I didn't necessarily like that. However, here at a 1/32 type of setting, it sounded a lot smoother and more complimentary, especially when I even actually took it out for a brief moment. But now I want to kick it up a notch and sculpt the reverb's tone further by using EQ. Now the goal of this process is to carefully shape the frequency response of the reverb to ensure it integrates smoothly with the vocal and the rest of the track as a whole. Most reverbs have at least a basic high and low cut filter, but some offer more extensive EQ options built right in. And Perfect Room 2 falls into the latter category there, as it does have a built-in EQ with filters and other notches we can make directly within the interface itself. Let's start by using the built-in filters to focus the reverb sound into a specific pocket of the track while removing unnecessary frequency information.
If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go?
This is sounding pretty good with a high cutoff just above 10K and a low cutoff just under 400 Hz. With our filters now in place, we can look to make a few more strategic EQ moves to help it sit better with our vocal. I often like to create a little bit more hype in the reverb by enhancing the high end slightly, but I also want to ensure that it doesn't interfere with my actual vocal sound. Therefore, I'm going to do a double move here, a high shelf boost to enhance some of the upper frequencies and increase the airiness of the reverb itself, and then I'll follow that up with a more calculated bell reduction to make sure that it still makes room for the vocal. Let's do that.
If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go?
I think this definitely sounds more appropriate and sculpted, tailored to the vocal in a way, reducing the lows and the highs, and then also doing some more strategic boosts and cuts as mentioned. And this main cut here of about almost 4.5 dB at 4.5 is really allowing that dry vocals intelligibility to take precedence over the reverb. Now, an additional way we can further sculpt the tonal presence of the reverb in relation to the vocal is using the frequency profile knob right here. Moving it to the right is essentially going to make the reverb sound brighter and airier, whereas if I move it to the left, it's going to do the opposite and make it sound darker and potentially warmer at the same time as it emphasizes the lower frequency content. Let's reset this, try it out, and see where we end up.
If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch.
Now, I think I prefer that sound the most, emphasizing the lower frequencies a bit more than the higher frequencies because I really want to keep this as a bit more of a darker ambient style of reverb rather than a bright poppy one. Now, the fourth step is to duck the reverb. This involves subtly reducing the level of the reverb whenever the vocal is also present. This technique prevents the reverb from clashing with the vocal, ultimately ensuring that the vocal has a clear and upfront presence in the mix. Now, traditionally, I've relied on a separate sidechain compressor for this. However, maintaining its feature-rich approach, Perfect Room 2 includes a built-in ducker which eliminates the need for an external compressor altogether. This ducker ultimately analyzes the incoming vocal signal and automatically reduces the reverb's level accordingly. All we need to do is simply adjust the amount of compression and the release time to control the ducking effect.
If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some low. let you watch? Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go?
So you're definitely able to hear a more noticeable reaction when I had this closer to 100%, but I think settling right here around 36% seems to be appropriate for me. I've also bumped up the release time so it's a little bit quicker and not keeping things compressed as long. Now, as a heads up, before we move into step 5, there's actually 2 additional optional steps that I'm going to give you, so make sure you stick around for that to see some advanced techniques that will help elevate your vocal reverb sound even further. And that leads us to our 5th step, which is to blend the reverb. Now, depending on how the reverb was applied, you're going to do this in one of 2 ways. If you opted to apply the reverb via a bus, you'll simply adjust the actual fader level of that bus to find a sweet spot within the context of the reverb and your dry vocal. I find that usually involves bringing the reverb fader level all the way down to infinite where you can't even hear it anymore, and then slowly increasing it and bringing it back in until I find that place where I just hear it and like it. In my case, however, I've applied it directly to my vocal track as we discussed earlier, so for me, I'm actually going to need to adjust it by playing with the mix level. And just like I proposed with my fader level, I'm actually going to bring it all the way down to 0% or infinite where I'm not going to be able to hear it anymore, and then I'm going to just slowly reintroduce it until I find a place where I like it.
If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go?
Now right there at 11% seems to be pretty good. So this is a slight reduction from where I initially had it. And that's not unusual. I typically find I'm going to have a bit less reverb than I initially set. We obviously are going to set a little bit more louder when we're getting in our settings. But once we have things dialed into a place where we like it, you're probably not going to need as much reverb presence unless you're going for something stylistically. You can obviously hear how forward the vocal sounds, but then also how complementary the reverb is. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm referring to setting a perfect vocal reverb. I want my reverb to add an ambience, but then be controlled and not too intrusive with the overall vocal performance. So now let's discuss some of the optional steps that I mentioned earlier. And the first one is to enhance the reverb further with some creative effects. One way that I like to enhance reverbs is by adding effects like flangers, choruses, or even phasers to the actual reverb chain. These effects add a unique texture to the reverb, helping it stand out more. While you can absolutely add a third-party plugin to your reverb chain once again, I'm actually going to use the built-in pitch modulation feature with Perfect Room 2, which will create a lush chorus reverb tail and add that texture that I was just talking about.
If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go? If there's some high, there's some low. Who's around? We don't know. If you're here, I'll let you watch. Will you catch me before you go?
So it's a little bit subtle, but you can just hear how it just kind of expands the reverb a bit. It feels a little bit wider, a little bit fuller, so to speak, and further emphasizes the point. Using creative effects can really enhance the reverb and make it just feel a little bit more present, a little bit more interesting in the mix. Now, one additional thing that we didn't talk about is adjusting the reverb's width. Reverb typically has a wide stereo image, meaning it spreads across the left and right speakers. This is what ultimately creates a sense of space and expansiveness. However, it's also crucial to consider mono compatibility. This ensures the reverb sounds good when played back on devices with little to no stereo separation, such as a single speaker, for example. Therefore, instead of widening reverb, which a lot of people are going to think of doing first, you might instead want to consider narrowing it. This can ultimately improve its mono compatibility. Once again, you can add a third-party stereo imaging plugin to your chain to achieve this, or you could simply use the built-in width knob that's included in Perfect Room 2. Now, by default, this is set to 100%, but I can reduce it all the way to 0% if I want to make a mono reverb sound happen, making it mono compatible. Now, because I am applying this directly to a mono vocal with a mono insert of the plugin, this width knob is really not going to make much of a difference here. However, if I was applying it to a stereo track, like a bus, for example, I may want to actually consider reducing this to improve the reverb's mono compatibility and achieve optimal translation across platforms. Now, all of these steps can be executed with third-party plugins, as I mentioned, or you could just make your life easier and use one plugin that has all of this functionality built right in, being Denise Audio's Perfect room too. As a reminder, I'm leaving a link to it down and below, and you could save 10% off if you purchase it by using my discount code 5piece. Like I said earlier though, reverb is tricky to get right. In fact, there's 10 common vocal reverb mistakes that a lot of people make, which I overview in this video that I'm going to leave on screen for you to watch next. If you got value out of the video, please smash that like button, and of course subscribe if you're new to see more mixing content like this in the future. I appreciate y'all, and I look forward to helping y'all again soon. Peace.